HFY hung silently in orbit, its matte black hull blending into the vast darkness of space. Commander Rinjor stood alone on the observation deck, his sharp, green eyes fixed on the serene blue sphere below. From this distance, Earth appeared so calm, so innocent. Yet he knew what lay beneath the soft white clouds and glittering oceans. His deep-set brow furrowed as memories he had tried to bury began to surface. It had been years since he last saw this planet. Once as a younger officer, he had been part of a galactic peacekeeping delegation that was drawn into the orbit of human conflict. Back then, he'd thought his superior training and advanced technology would protect him from what humans could unleash. But no degree of preparation, no set of protocols or strategies had shielded him from the visceral, chaotic nature of their warfare. They called him back now because he was the only alien commander with first-hand experience of the horrors humans could inflict not just on themselves but on all who crossed their path. The Galactic Peace Summit had requested a speaker who could educate the Council on the dangers humanity posed, if not properly managed. Rin had reluctantly accepted, knowing that it wasn't just the Council that needed the warning. It was the galaxy itself. Status report. Rin called out, his voice calm but firm. A faint hum preceded the reply as the ship's AI, Liss, responded through the overhead speakers. "We are maintaining a geostationary orbit, Commander. The diplomatic envoy is prepared to receive you. Your scheduled address to the Galactic Peace Summit begins in 6 hours." Rin nodded to himself. "Understood. Begin final descent procedures." As the HFY began its slow, controlled descent toward the summit's orbital station, Rin remained at the viewport. He couldn't help but recall his first encounter with Earth's surface, when his boots had sunk into damp soil and his senses were overwhelmed by the riot of life. Back then, he had been filled with curiosity and a quiet respect for the species that had clawed its way out of the dirt to reach the stars. But that respect had soon been tempered by the grim reality of their nature. Humanity's endless cycles of war and strife weren't just tragic. They were terrifying in their intensity. And he had seen it up close. Their soldiers pushing forward through impossible odds. Their commanders sacrificing whole cities to gain a tactical advantage. Their relentless drive to win at any cost. It wasn't just their ingenuity that had stunned him. It was their sheer willpower, their refusal to stop no matter how high the stakes climbed. "Commander," Liss's voice broke into his thoughts. "The envoy has sent another reminder. They request that you provide an outline of your address in advance. Would you like me to transmit the preliminary draft?" Rin shook his head. "No. I'll deliver. It live." Understood. He knew the Council would be expecting a dry, factual recounting of human military history. Dates, battle reports, logistical analysis. That's what the bureaucrats wanted. But Rin had no intention of providing a sterile lecture. Instead, he would show them what it had felt like. The fear, the confusion, the relentless, pounding energy of human warfare that he still couldn't fully shake, even after all these years. They needed to hear it the way he experienced it, raw and unfiltered. As the ship's engines hummed quietly, the station loomed closer. The Galactic Peace Summit's orbital headquarters was a vast spinning structure, its silvery arms catching the sunlight and glinting against the darkness. Within that station were representatives of hundreds of species, beings who had no idea what kind of storm humanity was capable of unleashing. Rin drew a deep breath and adjusted his uniform. He wasn't just speaking to the Council for their sake. He was speaking for every soldier he had seen cut down, every child caught in the crossfire, every civilization that might one day find itself in humanity's path. If his words could prevent another war, if they could convince the galaxy to tread carefully, then perhaps his years of haunted nights and battle scars would mean something. "Liss," Rin said quietly. "Prepare for docking." "Confirmed. Commander, proceeding to dock now." As the ship aligned with the station's docking port, Rin's grip tightened on the railing. The calmness he projected outward masked the storm inside. He was about to return to the galaxy's spotlight, to lay bare truths that many didn't want to hear. But if they were to understand humanity's capacity for war, then they needed to hear it from someone who had been there. someone who had survived it. The Edok 7 shuddered gently as it latched onto the station's docking clamps. Rin let the breath he had been holding slowly escape. The moment was here. It was time to break. The silence. The summit's central chamber was vast, the ceiling arcing overhead like a starry dome. The delegates filled the gallery, their various forms and voices blending into a kaleidoscope of sound and color. Rin Jor stood at the center, his metallic uniform gleaming under the chamber's soft lights, his gaze steady as he began his account. It was the human year they called 2274, Rin said, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. At that time, I was a senior officer in the Interstellar Mediation Corps. The United Earth Territories and the Martian Colonial Federation were locked in a bitter conflict over mining rights in the asteroid belt. We were dispatched to negotiate peace. What we found instead was war. The hum of conversation quieted as delegates leaned closer, their numerous eyes, sensors, and proboscises fixed on Rin. He continued, his words deliberate, each syllable weighed with memory. We arrived at Capital Starport, the primary orbital hub of the Martian Federation, thinking we were attending a diplomatic summit. The starport was an engineering marvel, an enormous wheel spinning in low orbit around Mars, its spokes hosting docks, habitats, and marketplaces. But when we docked, the station was already under siege. Rin's voice darkened. The UET had launched a surprise offensive, aiming to cripple the Martians' logistical backbone. They breached the station's outer defenses and boarded en masse. My crew and I found ourselves trapped between two human factions, each determined to destroy the other, with no regard for collateral damage. The chaos was indescribable. The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered to life. A simulated image of Capital Starport appeared, the station's structure splitting open to reveal internal corridors, glowing red with emergency lights. Delegates murmured as they saw holographic soldiers, fragile human figures clad in mismatched armor, moving through smoke-filled hallways, plasma bolts and railgun slugs tearing through the air. I remember standing in a docking bay, watching. Them fight, Rin said. The air was thick with smoke and ozone. The humans, barely more than children by our standards, fought with a ferocity I had never seen. They held no formations, no disciplined ranks. They moved in small, agile groups, using every piece of cover, every shadow to their advantage. They seemed to thrive in the confusion, their minds wired for this chaos. A tentacled delegate from the Zephyrian Accord raised a pseudopod in question. Surely they were simply desperate, fighting for survival. That is not unique to humans. Rin nodded. Desperation played a role, but it was more than that. They adapted in real time. When their enemy brought out a new weapon, they found a countermeasure before we could fully analyze what had happened. Their ability to improvise, to turn the station's maintenance drones into bombs, to convert fuel canisters into barricades, was beyond anything we had encountered from a species so young. The chamber's murmurs grew louder. Some delegates
whispered the belief, others concern.
And what of the station's inhabitants? Did they have no regard for civilians? Rin hesitated. Many civilians were caught in the crossfire. The starport's population had been evacuated to a degree, but not completely. I witnessed civilian transports trapped in docking bays blocked by debris or commandeered by armed groups. Some civilians armed themselves and joined the fray, choosing a side or simply defending their homes. The lines between combatant and non-combatant blurred, as they often do in human conflicts. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembly. For weeks the battle raged. The station became a patchwork of contested zones. Each time one side gained ground, the other responded with something even more destructive. Fires broke out in the habitat rings. Hull breaches vented precious atmosphere into space, and still they fought. A crystalline entity from the Shalzir consortium chimed in, its voice resonating like chiming bells. If they were so chaotic, how did they sustain such efforts? Surely their logistics must have faltered. Rin shook his head. That's what we thought too. But humans are resourceful. They scavenged from the station itself, repurposing everything. They took hull plates and fashioned them into makeshift armor. They drained non-essential systems for power, keeping their weapons and life support running long after we assumed they would fail. And their morale was not tied to traditional supply lines. They fought because they believed in their causes, whether it was duty to their government, loyalty to their commanders, or simply the will to survive. As the hologram faded, the room fell silent again. Rin could feel the unease settling over the delegates. For some, the story challenged their understanding of warfare. For others, it painted humanity as a force more unpredictable and dangerous than they had anticipated. "What was the outcome?" asked a delegate whose vocal cords produced a sound like the rustling of dry leaves. Rin's gaze fell. Eventually, the UET forces withdrew. They had taken heavy losses and had overextended themselves. The Martian Federation claimed victory, but at a staggering cost. The starport was left in ruins. It took years to rebuild. And for what? The peace was short-lived. The two factions resumed hostilities within months, fighting elsewhere in the system. He stepped back from the center of the chamber, his hands clasped behind his back. "This is what I came here to tell you. Human warfare isn't just brutal, it's relentless. It's not bound by the same rules or expectations you may hold for civilized conflict. They adapt, they endure, and they do whatever it takes to achieve their goals. You can't simply outlast them or overwhelm them with superior technology. You must understand their determination, their resourcefulness if you wish to deal with them wisely." The chamber was quiet for a moment longer, then filled with a low murmur. Some voices sounded uneasy, others skeptical. Rin knew he had unsettled them, but that had been his purpose. He stood silently, watching as the delegates began to grasp the full meaning of what he had shared. The siege of Capital Starport was only one story, and there were more to come. The gallery was quiet as the delegates absorbed the weight of Rin's first tale. He let the stillness linger, knowing the silence carried its own message. Then he raised his voice once more, calling their attention back to the center of the chamber. "The siege at Capital Starport was but one example," he began. "Let me tell you of another. This was not an orbital engagement, nor a battle of fleets. It was a ground war, fought on the barren surface of a fledgling colony world, a place called New Aegis." The holographic display flickered again, conjuring an image of the colony planet. New Aegis appeared as a wind-swept, desert-like world, its surface a patchwork of craters and jagged ravines. The delegates murmured at the sight, their attention sharpening. Rin stepped forward. "New Aegis was a contested colony," he said. "Earth and Mars had declared it a neutral zone, a place for independent settlers to stake their claims. For a time, it thrived as an experiment in cooperation. But when tensions between the Earth territories and the Martian Federation escalated, neutrality was quickly discarded. Both sides sought to control the planet's rich deposits of helionite, a mineral essential for faster-than-light navigation. The settlers who had struggled to build lives there were caught in the middle. Rin's expression darkened. At first, it was a proxy war. Mercenary groups funded by both factions carried out raids and sabotage. But within weeks, the conflict escalated. Earth and Mars deployed official forces, and soon the colony became a battlefield. My unit was sent to maintain the peace. But as before, peace was not what we found. The hologram shifted to show a wind-swept plain, dotted with crude outposts and mining rigs. Delegates watched intently as holographic figures, human soldiers in patchwork armor, settlers wielding improvised weapons, appeared on the terrain. "I will never forget the sight of that battlefield," Rin said. The sky was a permanent haze, a sickly orange from the dust storms and the burning wreckage of mining equipment. The colonists, ordinary people, farmers, engineers, were forced to fight alongside trained soldiers. They turned farming vehicles into makeshift tanks, turned mining explosives into artillery. Their ingenuity was horrifying in its effectiveness. He described one engagement in vivid detail: a Martian armored column advancing across the plains, only to be halted by an ambush of settlers and Earth forces working together. Using decoys and buried charges, they lured the Martian tanks into a narrow canyon. When the first explosion hit, the entire column was trapped, and the settlers swarmed. The resulting carnage was swift and total. The Martian forces were obliterated, their remains scattered across the rocky terrain. They weren't professionals, Rin said. They weren't trained in formal tactics, but what they lacked in discipline, they made up for in sheer ingenuity and resolve. They used the land itself as a weapon. They destroyed the enemy's morale as much as their machines. And their courage was relentless. The hologram dissolved, leaving the delegates in tense silence. A representative from the aquatic worlds of Drethil raised a watery appendage. And what of the civilian population? How did they endure? Rin's jaw tightened. They endured because they had no choice. The colonists knew that surrender would mean annihilation. For them, fighting wasn't a matter of loyalty to Earth or Mars. It was about survival. They fought for their homes, for their families, for the right to exist on that desolate world. The settlements became fortresses. Every farmstead was a bunker, every water reclamation unit a potential target. They bled and sacrificed because giving up wasn't an option. Another voice, metallic and cold, spoke up from the angular envoy of the Vark Consortium. You paint these humans as both victims and aggressors. Is there no line they will not cross? Rin paused, his gaze heavy. When they are backed into a corner, no. There is no line they will not cross. They adapt to the environment, to the resources at hand, to the level of desperation they face. On New Aegis, the ground itself was scorched. Fields of valuable crops burned to deny the enemy any advantage. Whole settlements were abandoned, their inhabitants taking to the wastelands rather than surrender. It wasn't just a war of soldiers, it was a war of an entire population, fighting with everything they had. He stepped back, letting the chamber digest his words. The silence felt colder now. The delegates, for all their technological advancement and interstellar wisdom, were beginning to understand what they faced. Humanity's resilience, their sheer will to survive, wasn't just a strength, it was a warning. Rin's voice softened, as he added, New Aegis never recovered. The fighting stopped eventually, but the scars remained. The settlers who survived scattered to other colonies. The planet's surface still bears the marks of that war, vast tracts of land left barren, the remnants of their makeshift weapons rusting under the pale sun. The conflict ended, but the cost was permanent. He looked around the chamber, his green eyes meeting countless alien gazes. This is what you must understand. Humanity doesn't give up. They don't stop. When they fight to the very last. And when they win, it is often a victory that leaves nothing whole in its wake. Rin fell silent, and the chamber followed suit. The lesson of New Aegis had been delivered, and the tension in the air was palpable. The delegates shifted uneasily, their understanding of humanity's nature growing darker with every word. Rin's voice softened as he began the final chapter of his address. The delegates, already heavy with the weight of his previous tales, leaned in, sensing the culmination of his message. What comes after a war? Rin asked, pacing slowly, at the center of the chamber. For the humans, it's not celebration or triumph as some of you might expect. Victory, if they can even call it that, often comes at an unbearable cost. He paused before continuing, his expression grave. I stayed behind on Earth for some time after the siege of Capital Starport. I saw what happened to the soldiers who survived. Those who returned were changed. Not just by physical scars, though there were many of those. The injuries were visible in their eyes, a distant, hollow look, as if they had left a part of themselves back on the battlefield. A delegate with crystalline limbs, from a race that knew no war, raised a hand-like appendage. But surely the end of conflict brings relief. A chance to rebuild? Rin shook his head. Not always. I visited rehabilitation centers filled with young men and women who couldn't recall how to smile. I met veterans who jumped at every sound, who couldn't sit with their backs to a door, who spoke in fragments about things that didn't make sense to anyone who hadn't been there. I met those who couldn't return to their homes because they no longer felt safe, because their minds were still trapped on the battlefield. He gestured toward the holographic display, which now displayed a war memorial on Earth. A blackened stone wall stretching across a quiet field, etched with tens of thousands of names. The delegates murmured softly, the solemn image leaving them, momentarily speechless. And then, Rin continued, there's the matter of what they leave behind. Families torn apart. Cities that take decades to rebuild. Entire generations growing up in the shadow of the wars that came before. On New Aegis, I saw colonists return to their abandoned settlements only to find them uninhabitable. Farms that once fed thousands were barren. The air still carried the acrid sting of chemicals used during the fighting. They won the war, if winning means that the other side retreated. But they paid a price they can never fully repay. The gallery was silent now. Even the most skeptical delegates were quiet. Their earlier whispers of doubt replaced with quiet reflection. Rin's words weren't just a warning, they were a plea. It's not that humans seek war for the sake of it, Rin said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's that they fight so fiercely because they believe they have no other choice. And when the fighting is done, they carry the weight of it forever. They remember, they tell stories. They build monuments not because they're proud, but because they don't want to forget what it cost. They live with the scars, and they keep moving forward. The holographic display shifted once more, showing a human soldier in a wheelchair, saluting a flag. Then it changed to a child placing flowers on a grave, and finally to a city street rebuilt from rubble, bustling again but bearing plaques that quietly marked where battles had been fought. The delegates watched in silence. This is what comes after, Rin said. The rebuilding, the remembering, and often the readiness to fight again if they feel they must. He stepped back from the center of the chamber and turned to the assembled delegates. You came here wanting to understand human warfare. Now you do. But more than that, you must understand what it means to them, the cost, the endurance, the unshakable will that drives them to fight, survive, and eventually rebuild. They don't fight for conquest. They fight because they believe it's the only way to preserve what they have. And if we ever hope to find lasting peace with humanity, we must recognize that about them. Rin stopped speaking and let the silence hang. The weight of his words seemed to press down on the chamber, leaving the delegates deep in thought. Some nodded slowly. Others stared into space, but none spoke immediately. The veteran alien commander's chilling tales of human warfare had done what no dry report or diplomatic communique could achieve. It had made them feel the full, unrelenting truth of humanity's nature.